jungles of the Far East are an unforgiving landscape in which to fight a war. In 1944, it was an environment in which only the toughest and best trained could hope to survive against a Japanese enemy who had mastered the art of jungle warfare. In the jungles of Burma, an American commander proved himself equal to the Japanese. He was Brigadier General Frank D. Merrill. His secretly recruited force was known as the 5307th Composite Unit. In official dispatches, it was called by its operational code name, Galahad. But the men he led became known to the world as Merrill's Marauders. The story of the Marauders was born out of a long series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Japanese, which began in 1931. In the Chinese province of Manchuria, Japanese troops policed the railway which served Japan's mining interests. In September 1931, the Japanese faked an attempt to sabotage the railway. They blamed the Chinese. The Japanese army stationed in Korea then invaded Manchuria and seized its capital, Mukden. By the end of 1932, the Japanese had conquered the whole of Manchuria and parts of neighboring Mongolia. Japan's sole concession to international protest was to install the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as puppet governor and later emperor of a supposedly new independent state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations sent a team to report on Manchuria.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
The League condemned Japan as an aggressor.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Matsuoka, délégué du Japon. I call on His Excellency, Monsieur Matsuoka, delegate of Japan. It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East.
Having defied the League of Nations, the Japanese delegates walked out, never to return. In January 1932, the Japanese fleet bombarded the port of Shanghai. A savage air attack was launched against the Chinese section of the city. There was heavy fighting between Japanese Marines and the Chinese 19th Route Army. Eventually, it took over 75,000 Japanese troops to capture Shanghai. Shifting their campaign to northern China, the Japanese conquered an area extending to within 15 miles of Beijing. Rallying Chinese resistance was Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party. By early 1938, the Japanese controlled China's coastline and most of its major cities. Chiang was driven west to set up a new capital at Chongqing in the province of Sichuan. His only supply link with the outside world was now the Burma Road. This ran from Lashio to the Chinese city of Kunming. Over 200,000 Chinese had labored to open up this vital artery running through mountainous terrain. Many of them died in the fight to sustain blockaded China against the Japanese. The Burma Road was completed late in 1938, bringing vital guns and fuel to the beleaguered Chinese. The United States had initially held back from involvement in the conflict in China. But as the crisis deepened, American interests in the Pacific came under threat. Nevertheless, President Roosevelt had his hands full at home, dealing with the powerful isolationist lobby, the ravages of the Depression, and fulfilling the promises he had made in his New Deal with the American people. In December 1937, Japanese warplanes sank a U.S. Navy gunboat, the Panay, in the Yangtze River. Prompt and profuse apologies from Tokyo diffused the crisis caused by the sinking of the Panay, but also alerted President Roosevelt to the growing threat posed by unchecked Japanese expansion. The Panay incident could not be forgotten. War between the United States and Japan became inevitable in 1941, when, in an attempt to halt further Japanese expansion, Roosevelt placed an embargo on oil exports to Japan. Apart from plentiful hydroelectric power, the Japanese had few natural resources of their own. And in the dry season, even the levels of hydroelectric power dipped dramatically. This lack of natural resources had been the driving force behind the war of conquest in China. The Japanese faced two alternatives: a humiliating withdrawal from the territories they had conquered, or the launching of a wider campaign of conquest to seize the industrial and agricultural resources of the Far East. Now that the Americans had turned off the oil tap, the Japanese economy would quickly grind to a halt. Would the Japanese choose peace or war? They chose war. By the spring of 1941, their plans for an Oriental blitzkrieg were far along. Their armies had been battle-hardened by the years of fighting in China, and their effectiveness badly underestimated by Western military experts. The Japanese Navy also understood the importance of air power, even though Japan's Emperor Hirohito had been warned by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, that a war with the United States could be lost. Yamamoto knew the United States well and appreciated the almost limitless American industrial capacity which would be unlocked by war. He could guarantee the Emperor only 6 months of victory. Yamamoto was far less impressed by the two major colonial powers in the Far East, the Dutch and the British. The British stronghold in Singapore, the linchpin of their Far Eastern defenses, seemed secure. The troops defending the Malaysian peninsula were confident. But they had no tanks, and more seriously, lacked the air cover which the Japanese ground forces would enjoy. Like their transport, the troops were tied to the main roads. They had not been trained to fight in the jungle. Japan's ambitious war plans included an attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet's base at Pearl Harbor, the invasion of the Philippines, and the occupation of the British and Dutch colonies. The Japanese Pacific Drive began with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's response was swift.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America now began to mobilize the manpower and the industrial might about which Admiral Yamamoto had warned his emperor. But America's response was to begin in the shadow of strategic disaster in the Pacific and the Far East.